Okay, welcome back everybody. We're going to get started just to keep on track with time a little bit. So you're very welcome to this second session of the conference. Welcome to those of you who are here in reality, and welcome also to people who are following online. So thank you for the tweet, Vicky, and anybody else who might be watching. So I want to just keep introductions brief so we have plenty of time for the papers and discussions afterwards. And in any case, this is one of those panels where the speakers, to use the cliche, require no introduction, but they get one anyway. So it's great to welcome here Julie and Joanne, who've come a very, very long distance, as I know many speakers have, and we're delighted to have them here. They're going to deliver this paper as a kind of double act, I think, isn't that right? And we know them as a double act from their book, of course, Women's Intercultural Performance. And indeed in other capacities as well. They've both jointly been involved in a fantastic digital humanities project which is called OzStage. If you don't know it, check it out. It is a list of every production, more or less, or it aims to be every production that has appeared in Australia since European settlers arrived. So it's an amazing undertaking, fantastic piece of research, great tool but also a great resource as well. Individually then, we know Julie, of course, is an Emerita Professor at Flinders University, where she spent many years as the Director of the Drama Centre there, and is currently a Professor too at the Centre for Ibsen Studies at the University of Oslo. So she has done a great deal of research on Ibsen, and two forthcoming books about Ibsen are for Nick Hearn Books, Ibsen on Theatre, and for Palgrave Macmillan, a global production history of A Doll's House, which I think is going to be fantastic, and very much looking forward to reading that. Joanne then is Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Queensland. And her many publications include the book Post-Colonial Drama, which she co-authored with Helen Gilbert, Women's Intercultural Performance with Julie, as I already mentioned, and in 2006, Unsettling Space for Palgrave Macmillan. More recently then, we have in 2014, Theatre's Heterotopias, Performance and the Cultural Politics of Space, and a co-edited volume with Anna Birch called Performing Site-Specific Theatre. A major digital humanities tool then that she has developed is called Ortelia, and this analyses and archives art gallery, museum and theatre spaces and exhibitions. So two great speakers, really looking forward to the paper, and you are very welcome.
Part of this paper is going to be about OzStage, and I'll just clarify from Patrick's introduction. OzStage attempts to document performance from 2000 forward, and then sporadically, according to information to hand, backwards to settlement. Okay, as the paper proceeds, you may feel the need to move a little bit forward because some of the images that we're going to show won't be as large font as this. Please feel free to move forward if you like. Some of them have very tiny writing. We don't expect you to be able to read everything. It's more the overall effect than the individual words on the screen. So I'll just warn you about that. Okay, our presentation explores interculturalism 15 years after the publication of Women's Intercultural Performance. Our work practices have changed quite markedly in this time because of shifts in cultural, aesthetic, methodological, and political contexts, and because of the availability of new research tools. We introduce a digital humanities methodology to intercultural studies of global transmission using two examples. Over 3,000 international productions of Ibsen's A Doll's House, and the nature of intercultural performance imports and exports in Australia over the last 2 years. We argue the case for quantitative research methods to provide a new dimension to analyzing intercultural performance. But first, we contextualize the book and its origins, and the reasons why it is no longer possible to produce such a volume now. During the 1990s, we were very involved in intercultural arts practice. Together, we worked on the 1994 Third International Women Playwrights Conference in Adelaide. This major festival of presentations and performance brought together 457 artists from 40 cultures who spoke 30 languages. 50 of the delegates were funded by multiple Australian and overseas agencies. Julie organized the IWPC, the annual Australasian Drama Studies Association conference that was linked to it, and the funding, while together we assembled a book of interviews with selected international playwrights. With my background in post-colonial theory and Julie's in intercultural practice, we then collaborated on women's intercultural performance. Of the many things to emerge from these experiences were strong desires among artists to collaborate across cultures, particularly in Australia, between European and Indigenous cultures. It may be that there is something implicit about performance itself that seeks to know the other, or even the same in the other, despite the difficulties in actually doing so. Arts practice encourages cross-cultural communication because what happens at the borders tends to be the most interesting and exciting. Artists look for new means of expression and often find those elsewhere, issues of appropriation aside. This differs from the perspective of the nation, which tends to repel the other to protect its borders. We were interested in how artists were working together, not in a naive way or not that pushed a particular barrow. We saw that there was a desire to talk and share and borrow and find ways to communicate and use other people's ways of communication, often in an attempt to achieve social justice through theatre.
And just a very quick intervention. I did about 8 major international intercultural arts projects in that decade of the 90s with Japanese, Filipino and Korean artists. And all of these were extremely well funded, and 5 of them were commissioned as part of international festivals. Now, the funding came from government sources, both Australian and overseas, including the Australia Council and the Japan Foundation and the Korean Foundation. Now, it was a logical step for us, therefore, to work on intercultural performance when it was very much the aesthetic, political and performance currency of the day in Australia. And when we conceptualised the book, we felt we were kind of close up on that world of intercultural arts practice.
Women's intercultural performance provided a way to interpret performances that women were making with performers who sought genuine engagement across cultural lines with other like-minded performers. It examined the take-up of 2 key women-focused Western texts, A Doll's House and Antigone, in non-Western contexts, China, Japan, Iran, and Argentina. We investigated ritual through Korean shamanism and Warlpiri women's performance from the central desert region of Australia. We addressed space as metonymic for geopolitical displacements and the body to assess representations of racial and cultural identity via the sexually differentiated performing body, and also researched some of the market forces that shaped performance in festivals and markets, arts markets. The book was predicated on identity spaces, or the descriptors of identity through which artists define themselves and their work. Although we were interested in the power relationships that underpinned intercultural women's theatre, and this was central to our work on Indigenous performance in the global arts market, we provided what we call a close-up view of symbolic power within individual productions. This is also a logical extension of the way in which we were trained, and we all know how to deeply analyze productions and to make broader conclusions from those analyses, bolstered by varying degrees of materialist scrutiny. Of course, we knew that there were wider political and economic forces at work that were facilitating our intercultural work, but we didn't focus on them, particularly since it appeared that the attention to interculturalism implicitly and explicitly would continue, a naive assumption as it turned out. We just made use of the forces as relevant. The Playwrights Conference, the creative projects that Julie mentioned, and our research grant for writing the book, which together accrued funding in excess of $1 million. There's nothing wrong with the model per se, but we no longer live in what we could call an era of intercultural performance, loosely bracketed by the fall of the Berlin Wall and 9/11. The context for such performance has altered markedly, in what is now a protectionist era. There is no longer an interest in Australia, and I should emphasize that I'm talking, both of us are, well, I'm speaking from the perspective of Australia, and Julie a little bit more internationally. So there's no longer an interest in Australia in addressing cultural difference in the surrounding nations, much less in funding it. The events of 9/11 and the subsequent rise of Islamophobia were compounded in Australia by underlying racial tensions and bipartisan support for a crackdown on border security, with mandatory detention and offshore processing of asylum seekers that continues today. Now, the structures that framed our work are antipathetic to the kind of intercultural investigation that we described, of cultures meeting within the creative process. Instead, we see something more akin to transnationalism, or cultural products moving between or being reconfigured by other cultures and shared in performance. As we shall see, it is a sort of meta-interculturalism, where the state becomes a major player looking for market share. And that is aside from shifts in the definition of interculturalism, depending on the cultural context. And Charlotte and Jason provided us a nice overview of that this morning. We tend to describe our present research in terms like cultural transmission, transnational studies, globalization, digital humanities, and distant visions. The multiculturalism of Europe is quite a different entity from Australia. Australia has moved from state multiculturalism to an implicit national policy of cultural assimilation with draconian border protection practices. Since the election of the John Howard government in 1996, Khan et al. Note the diminishing currency of multiculturalism as a national policy priority, largely because of the ascendancy of a conservative politics of Anglo-nationalism on the political right. So much so that multiculturalism has been largely displaced by the broader category of diversity, dispersing the meanings and functions of multicultural discourse. And I think this is really interesting in the context of what Jason and Charlotte was saying, where it seems to have moved from multiculturalism to interculturalism. Australia moving from multiculturalism to diversity is just even watering things down more. Nevertheless, the Australian government continues to pursue greater economic ties with a broadly defined Asia, irony notwithstanding. Today's presentation may look like two separate projects, but we hope it will become clear that both areas of research are inextricably linked to the acceptance or rejection of European cultural hegemony.
So our close-up studies of women's intercultural performance practice are now changed, if you like, into our work on distant visions, which are based on quantitative analysis that deliver qualitative interpretations of the social, political, and economic forces that facilitate or block cultural transmission at the transnational level. We're not the first researchers to use quantitative techniques to investigate cultural transmission. Franco Moretti argues that in the quantitative readings, distance is not an obstacle, but a specific form of knowledge. Fewer elements, hence a sharper sense of their overall connections. And this is an important premise for our current work. Joanne and I enjoyed working collaboratively, and we've done so for 20 years, but working in the digital humanities areas has taken research collaboration to a completely different level. The data we're going to show you today has been gathered by dozens of international scholars. The computer visualizations are the work of our colleague in Australia, Dr. Jonathan Bollen, and we also work closely with Professor Frode Helland, the director of the Ibsen Center in Oslo, in terms of doing a lot of the analysis of what you then see as these distant visions. So I'm going to talk about the aspect of our work that has the direct connection to the chapter in Women's Intercultural Performance that dealt with the power relations underlying the global transmission of European plays, specifically Ibsen's A Doll's House. This text is high up on the list of the most performed plays in world theatre, and that's a montage from the first production in 1879 in Copenhagen. what we have is records of performances from 87 different countries with titles that exceed the 37 languages of its translation. Now, our first problem was how to come to grips with this cultural field that's the global production history of A Doll's House. And our first kind of move has been to use the Norwegian title of the play, Et Dukkehjem, to refer to the abstract entity or work that consists of over 3,000 performances in the Ibsen Stage database, because it's this work of 3,000 plus productions rather than the literal Dano-Norwegian text by Ibsen that is our focus. And we consider that the background condition of this cultural field, this work, is one of ever-increasing diversity. And while I'm talking, we will illustrate this diversity with random images taken from productions of A Doll's House. It's just really to give you kind of a visual hit on how diverse these productions are. So our initial task has been to establish whether there is a common core to this signifying system. As the play's been performed everywhere from major state theatres to open-air rural venues in sub-Saharan Africa to a car park in LA, there's clearly no consistency in performance space or in the cultures of spectatorship within this work. As adaptations of the play have included musicals, dance, puppetry, every electronic media, including YouTube, queer avant-garde, post-dramatic, women's theatre, applied theatres of development, education and social justice, there is clearly no common genre that holds the work together. With the effects of translation, common linguistic features have disappeared. And if any remain, the silent films, dance and photographic versions have disqualified them from being common core. The images you're looking at demonstrate there's no core visual language. And the characters also are not consistent. We might imagine they would be more consistent, but they're not. They've been renamed, but not just that. They've been resexed, they've been cut, they've been combined, they've been doubled. Their class, caste, ethnicity, gender assignment and sexual preferences have all been changed. So all that remains is the plot. By comparing, I can't explain how we did this, but using network analysis, we compared the structures of multiple adaptations. And we came up with a few plot events that we found were common. And from those plot events, we came up with this simplified narrative, which is as close as we can get to a common core that holds together this work. And the story goes. The story concerns a couple living in an unequal sexual relationship with a background of several years of financial insecurity. A hidden secret lurks beneath their relationship. The secret is revealed by a hostile intruder. It concerns the past of the subordinate partner and involves an illegal act motivated by a desire to protect the dominant partner. The details regarding the secret tend to involve illegal borrowing of capital and goods. There's a double action with the revelation of a hidden secret. Its announcement is greeted as a catastrophe, but some kind of redemption follows. The latter is engineered through the intervention of a character who functions as a helper. Despite the removal of the threat, the relationship between the couple is temporarily or more permanently damaged. This generalized narrative does retain a linear cause and effect structure and a strong association between money and an intimate sexual relationship. What is not replicated are any of the supposedly universal themes cited by scholars as reasons for the play's international success. And these include 19th century discourses on subjectivity, emancipation of women, culture degeneration, or cultures of motherhood. At a structural level, we found no increase in the complexity of individual plot structures of adaptations. But when we look at the abstract entity of the work, the number of plot events has expanded from the original number of 70 plot events in Ibsen's text to over 20,000. And with every new adaptation, not only is it probable that this number will increase, but also that the common plot core is likely to diminish further. Which confirms our premise that the background condition of the work is one of increasing diversity and complexity. And here we're using complexity in its simple sense to describe an increase in parts, not an increase in functionality. Now, the background condition then of the work is messy, confused, chaotic, unless there is a force operating within the field that is somehow constraining or limiting diversity, and is actually, in a sense, creating sameness. So our premise is we don't have to explain, though I have just you, we don't have to explain diversity, we have to explain sameness. We have to explain what forces are constraining diversity. So I'm going to talk about three different forces now. Our first example is a force that is working always to grow the work. So it's external to the field, and it's working to grow the work, to keep encouraging artists to select Ibsen's play as the source text for production and constrain diversity at the level of repertoire choice. So, the more this force can make people choose the Doll's House, the more, in a sense, they constrain the choice of people to pick out the things in the repertoire. Now, Régis Debray suggests that every idea, religion, or text that survives has behind it an institution that, in his words, is acting as a kind of registry or patent office. But rather than passively conserving its charges, it is never done sifting, revising, censoring, interpreting, and peddling them. Analysing our production data using mapping tools has foregrounded a major institution peddling a doll's house today, and it's the Norwegian state. In 2011, the then Norwegian foreign minister and current leader of the opposition, Johan Gahr Støre, made the following statement. The name Ibsen is a more familiar brand, if one can use such a term, than Norway. Under his leadership, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs promoted Ibsen as a national symbol of arguably universal and Norwegian values, such as gender equality, accountability in governance, democracy, and the protection of the environment. The Norwegian government began using A Doll's House as a brand in 1937 with the National Theatre Tour to Paris for an international expo. In 1940, a few weeks after the German invasion of Norway, A Doll's House was used to signify national resistance, with Nora being interpreted as Mother Norway, bursting with pain and yet full of strength. By the 1960s and 70s, the play was regularly toured to build national culture, and with the oil revenues started to roll in during the 90s, the play was co-opted into Norway's efforts to build international influence. Now, in the last 20 years, this is a map showing flow of money from Norway associated with Ibsen. And you've got three different lines, and I know it's difficult to see, but one of them is a program called Nora's Sisters I'm going to talk about, the Ibsen Awards, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I'll explain how this kind of fits together. In the last 20 years, large amounts of taxpayers' money have been invested in Ibsen activities through the Ministry of the Arts, Education, Research and Foreign Affairs, as well as special initiatives including festivals, prizes, scholarships and awards. A preliminary survey has shown that public expenditure on Ibsen in 2011 and 2012 alone was approximately 50 million kroner. That's 8.5 million US in just those 2 years. Now, this is the Nora's Sister program. A Doll's House has been promoted primarily through the Nora's Sisters program. Norwegian embassies have been using this program to convene seminars on gender equality and the respective roles of today's women and men in different societies and cultural settings. This relates very much, I think, to some of what, when I put my hand up about this whole problem about feminism and internationalism, and relates to everything we were talking about this morning. So these seminars, usually accompanied by a performance of A Doll's House, have tended to cluster in low and middle income countries, particularly in Islamic cultures and the Middle East to the subcontinent, and also in sub-Saharan Africa. This pattern of intervention through public diplomacy is replicated in a second significant programme sponsored by the Norwegian government, the Ibsen Award Scholarships. This is established in 2008. It supports theatre projects that seek to, quote, further the discourses of Ibsen, unquote. It has funded numerous Doll's House projects, including a translation into Arabic, a Turkish performance into Kurdish, an Egyptian dance work, and a meeting for artists responsible for adapting the play in Mozambique, Zambia, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and South Africa. I have to put my hand up and say, this is the Ibsen industry I'm talking about, and I'm part of it. You know, this is my disclaimer. I'm not separated. I'm unfortunately totally incorporated. When the Ibsen Awards provides up to $50,000 as sponsorship for individual projects, the Ibsen International Festival invites international productions that are seen as having aesthetic value to Oslo. Now, these productions have come from, and you can see all the countries they've come from, Burkina Faso, Nepal, Germany, the US, England, Egypt, Mozambique, and the Netherlands. The icing on the cake is the International Ibsen Award. Now, this is bestowed on a theatre practitioner who has, quote, made a significant contribution to the art form of theatre, unquote. Apart from the symbolic capital attached to the award, there's a cash prize worth €300,000. To date, the prize has only been awarded to artists living in France, Germany, and Norway. In the field of public diplomacy, Canada and Norway are held up as today's success stories of niche branding based on associations of what Joseph Nye calls attractive causes. The Canadians have used landmine activism, the Norwegians peace initiatives and gender equality. And a Doll's House has been a key commodity in this international branding exercise. The evidence is overwhelming that the Norwegian state is actively encouraging global theatre artists to produce Ibsen plays. But the contradiction is that they're peddling the play as an empty signifier to be filled by any content deemed appropriate by global artists. Yet it would be naive to think that the Norwegian financial and symbolic capital is being dispensed without reference to the values of the social democratic state. Norway, like so many other countries in Europe, is experiencing the growing effects of anxiety in relation to global flows of EU citizens, migrants, and refugees. So the question is the freedom with which the global artists are being encouraged to experiment with the Doll's House a signifier of freedom of artistic expression, as understood in a social democratic state, or, on the other hand, is it itself a metaphor for cultural assimilation? In other words, difference can be tolerated and celebrated as long as it is contained within the familiar framework of the European narrative. The political contradictions and confusions involving Ibsen branding blew wide open last year when the Ibsen Award was given to Peter Hanke. There were protests outside the Oslo Theatre where the prize ceremony was held because of Hanke's ambivalent position over the trial of Slobodan Milosevic and the fact that he had spoken at Milosevic's funeral in Belgrade. The demonstrators in Oslo demanded that Hanke return the prize, called him a genocide denier, and booed as he entered the theatre. He accepted the prize, but returned the money, asking for it to be donated to a Bosnian organisation to build a children's swimming pool. But the whole debate about what right does an artist have? I mean, what does freedom of speech mean when it's not in the work, but it's when it's in your public fest? So this has all been debated at great length in Norway. Leaving that to one side, Joan's going to come back to this question of the role of the nation in cultural transmission. But I'm going to switch focus now to forces of distribution. In other words, the trade routes used by Edukayem, and in particular reference to touring productions. Now, the early breakthrough of Ibsen as a transnational artist is usually attributed to the work of the celebrated critics and artists of the European avant-garde. Pascal Casanova has argued that it was the collective foreign annexation of Ibsen in Britain, Ireland, and England that made Ibsen, quote, universally recognised as universal, end quote. Yet the numbers of spectators introduced to Ibsen's A Doll's House through the efforts of late 19th century European avant-garde theatres was tiny when compared to the commercial audiences of the actress-managers who included the play in their touring repertoires. they effectively partitioned the world into kind of doll's house zones, right? And this was all really based on, it really is based on migration, European colonization and migration and spheres of influence. And they divide the world up between them between about 1880 and 1920. And Joanne's going to put up, this is kind of mapping. So this is touring productions, and they're starting from 1880. And what we've done here is we've divided them into what we see as kind of zones or language dominant areas. So what you've got, if you look at the blue, that's the Scandinavians. That's what they're touring in this period. So they don't really move much outside their own geographic area. The red are the Germans and the Poles. The green are the English language productions. And the purple, that actually covers France, Italy, and Portugal. And they've been put together because the French, the Portuguese and the Italians use the French version of the play, they translate it. And this network, this particular circuit that is the Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina circuit is one that was really very strong for the French touring companies in the 19th century. And it's the Italian, actually, who takes us over to Mexico. So this is kind of the world divided up on trade routes according to European migration and colonization up until 1920. And they don't really shift for quite a while. So the next lot, can we look at the next one, Joe? This is all the touring that happens really between 1920 and 1950. It closes right down. There's not much kind of traffic of this play at all. I don't have comparative about other tours of other playwrights during this time, but I suspect that there's a general closing down of this sort of activity during that period. Again, you see the Scandinavians are beginning to do a bit more. The French and the Germans a bit, that's it. The English aren't doing any. This takes us into the 1950 to 1990, and here you can see this blue is all coming out of Norway. This is when Norway really claims it as an icon and starts doing the touring. But they're also doing all of this national touring, which is why they're covering the whole country. A little bit of English, a little bit of German, and then you've got the Greeks who actually the Greeks do a circuit which is the circuit to Turkey and Egypt. And the next one. Now this is what happens in 1990. And it's we find this quite extraordinary when we look at it. Now again, the Germans really dominating the structure at the moment. The Scandinavians the Norwegians retreated back home because all the yellow are the productions that they're pulling in for the Ibsen festival. So there are some others in there, but basically what's happening is we put everybody else, because you've got all sorts of different languages, into the yellow. But you see that the major dominant really form is the German, and the English is still there. The green is still there. But that's actually what's happening between 1990 and the present day. Okay. The third and last force, right, stick with us for a while. This is, the third one is what's happening inside the field. These have been external forces, trade routes and the nation state. Now we're going to try and look inside. It's partly because we want to get a sense of what's happening between artists working together. So we've cultural transmission between artists is far less predictable than the flows sanctioned by the nation state or by institutions. And the links between participating artists in the cultural field of Erdogan are invisible pathways through which performance knowledge, as a form of theatrical inheritance, passes between generations. Now, this knowledge, again, can function as a constraint, because if you're passing knowledge in the form of a performance tradition, you actually limit the creative innovation as it's passed in tradition. But this involves us kind of doing a bit of you have to bear with us because we've got to move into a different format to be able to show you this. one of the things that we were interested in is how much flow is there between people, between different productions. And we might think that in one play, you know, there are obviously going to be some directors who do 2 productions of the play. There might be, we knew that there were some early Noras that had performed guesting, like opera singers at various places. You know in somebody's, an actor's life, they may end up playing Torvald at one point and Dr. Rank later. So we anticipated we would find these connections. We had absolutely no idea how dense they were. This is these are kind of the 2 mega clusters, and they are mega. You know, we're talking about links between about 60% of the artists in our database. It's extraordinary. On the left-hand side, you've got what we call the Scandinavian cluster, though of course it's the sphere of influence of Scandinavia. And on the right-hand side is the German influence. And it's fascinating to us that actually they never cross. They are completely separate. If I just show you, scroll down, this is what we thought we'd see. Now that's kind of, you know, so something like, I'll put the arrow on it, that is the kind of connection we thought we'd see. Now I need to explain to you that each of the dots you're looking at are performances, right? And the links between them, the grey lines, are the actors. We've taken out the writers, we've taken out the translators, so you're just seeing really directors and actors, designers. So this, to give you a bit of a clearer idea, so this kind of density of interconnection is quite extraordinary. If I show you this one, this is in the middle of the German cluster. It gives you a bit more of a sense. So you can see that, for example, there's a link here where my arrow is between 1897, and then there's a link over to 1900. Now, when you get these kind of really thick pathways, you know, where you've got lots and lots of people, that's because that's a tour, and the tours are very, very important in this cultural transmission. But a tour, in our databases, we don't treat a production that goes on tour as one entry. We treat it as a different entry every time it settles in a new place, because there could have been cast changes, there are inevitable changes in the production. So every season in a tour is a separate event. So that's the same production on tour. But when we get to this is an individual making a connection. So all of these lines are individuals that are connecting these different productions of what is supposedly the same play. If I want, because just to kind of demonstrate this, that if I then want, for example, to ask the computer to help me find who these people are, then what I can do is click on this line there, it'll turn yellow, and then you'll see the name of the person. Okay, so it becomes really easy to be able to work out. You could never do this without computers, you know, there's no way you could trace this. But once you've got this, you can actually find who's the connection that's going from Bonn to New York, so it helps you understand that whole thing about cultural transmission through individual artists. And the last one here, that I'll just show you of this, and I'm nearly done, this is when we start putting time into it. So this down here, at the bottom here, this is the first production, Copenhagen, right? And this is going everywhere, all over. I'm only in the Scandinavian cluster now. But what we've asked the computer to do is tell us how long can we take an unbroken handing on of, you know, artistic knowledge from production to production to production. If we start in 1879, where do we end up? And we find out that we end up with an unbroken line of of cultural transmission right up to 2014. And that one takes us through 63 different productions. So the importance of this to us, if I can go to the last bit of this, is that we asked ourselves, so yes, we could do 62 events over 135 years. It's the longest line we came up with, but there are many more lines that takes. We've got a lot that takes in the German section, German cluster to the 1970s, from 1880 to 1970, and in the Scandinavians we've got many that take us from 1879 through to 1990s. we then did an analysis of those lines, and particularly the Scandinavian, the most important Scandinavian line, and we found that one of the most important factors in that line was theatrical families. Now, I always think, theatrical families die out in Europe, 19th century. No, not in Norway, and we haven't done the analysis on later in terms of the other major clusters, but we found in that line that was taking us through that length of time, we found that there were 29 key artists who were doing links for us, because obviously, I will get, but anyway, out of them, 15 have family connections. So you've got Nora's mothers passing the role to daughters. You've got one family was responsible for 3 productions from 1940 to 1970, and there's a divorced couple that couple of divorced couples where they go off and do different lines. But if I, just quickly, I'll just take you up so you can see that's how. Oh, we switched off.
Just took a nap.
Okay. Okay. No.
It'll come back.
I'll finish while you're saying, because that's the last of those images anyway. So I need to get out of this into the thing. So just very quickly, going back to this notion of constraint.
I think in our smart room, the projector switches off every 3 hours or something, and then comes back on, so I apologize, Julie.
That's all right. All right, while it's coming on, I'll just explain to you what I'm just going to show you at the very end of this presentation on the Doll's House stuff. When we look at that line, we then say, well, okay, going back to this idea of forces of constraint, can we see, once we know what the line is, and we can investigate all those productions, can we see things handed through that line? And so what we came up with is we've actually got a gesture that we can find from 1879, which I will show you, that appears in a production in 1990. That degree of transmission between actors in productions as a force of constraint we found very, very interesting. And we also found that this same dominant tradition, what we call the dominant tradition of the production, does take us to China as well. And that will be the last image that I'd show if we ever get the projector back. So anyway, before I hand over to Joanne, a quick disclaimer. Soft diplomacy, commercial touring and cultural transmission between artists are only 3 of the forces at work in Educayan. Ibsen's plays had a long association with force fields of social change, particularly with regard to gender division and sexual expression, as is clear from the material on China, Iran and Japan that we include in Women's Intercultural Performance. So our reason for choosing to tell such a Eurocentric story today will become clear when Joanne takes over now to explain what we think is happening in Australia.
And you have yours.
All right, so this is the gesture, just go through the gesture. This is Helmer, not the, we know that the Tarantella image, is everywhere, but if you look at Helmer there, right, this is the very first production, and this is Helmer in 1990. And then if I trace back, that's Helmer in 1880s, and this is Helmer in the 1850s. So you really can see that tradition. This gesture doesn't go to China, but the tradition does, and this is 1856 in China. And again, because we can use those, we know who took it there. So it's I think, a very useful tool when you want to actually see how artists are working outside of what the power of the state or commercial interest is. Thank you very much. Over to you, Joanne.
Okay. Wait, there's more.
Really halfway through.
Okay. Having used distant vision to interrogate the global dominance of a single European canonical work, we are employing the same methodology to tackle a far harder problem: how these same forces work within the boundaries of a single nation. We apply this methodology to the much larger data set of AusStage, the Australian database for the performing arts, to investigate the wider effects of product, nation of origin, contributors, funding, and what these factors produce in the cultural transmission of one nation. just an indication of what Ozstage covers. From this data, we ask, what are the forces of border protection operating in our cultural sphere that attempt to limit the movement of productions, and can they be subverted by individual artists? Numerous forces determine what cultural products go in and out of Australia, but in this presentation, we'll just cover or just concentrate on the period 2012 to 2014. And I'll just mention that while Julie's been able to work on the Ibsen data over some time, what I'm presenting is very preliminary. This is just the beginning of our investigation. First, some background. We have begun our analysis with the Ozstage data on festivals. For financial reasons, the festivals have the highest concentration of international work. Imports are selected by the festival artistic directors, who are answerable to boards, usually appointed by state governments and dependent on the generosity of their sponsors. Festivals have in recent decades also been significant locations to commission and program intercultural productions. The festivals we examined, so far only main stage, are these. Particular to Australia's geography is the tension between premieres and exclusives, and the need to tour overseas productions to other parts of the country. Often the cost of traveling to Australia requires recouping through runs elsewhere. A deliberate attempt was made to increase the presence of East and Southeast Asian performance in Australia during the 1980s and 90s. This reflected government soft diplomacy, particularly during the era of Prime Minister Paul Keating. Before we analyzed the data, we suspected that there had been a shift back to Europe, but we had no idea how far. So you've got on this PowerPoint here an indication of where the performances in the festivals in this 2 to 3 year window are coming from. South America and Africa might as well not figure at all. There's just really one in each. And the concentration in Asia was, for me, remarkably small. I expected it to be far, far larger. We've got a little bit in the US, and it is US rather than only a tiny bit in Canada, and then the concentration is in Europe. The next image gives you a little bit better indication of where in Europe those productions are coming from. The data about festivals can be presented in a variety of ways. First point I need to make, though, is the data that I'm working on focuses on organizations, whereas Julie focused on productions or events and people. So we're investigating the data that's in Ozstage from quite different prisms. Organizations include theater companies, funders, producers, sponsors, production companies, arts agencies, festivals, etc. And the address of an organization places it in a country. The data is also what was, as I said, performed in Australia at festivals in this window, not all performances in Australia in these years. So I've shown you the two images on PowerPoint. At a much more complex level, this that is coming up in a moment is a cluster map of all the organizations that are included in our sample data. So that's the 2012 to 2014 data. And it just looks impossible to understand at first. And I don't expect you to be able to read the names of any of those now, but it's more to give you a sense of what we're working with in this investigation. So we added, to help make it a little bit clearer, we've added color coding to identify the different types of functions of these organizations. For example, pink is sponsorship, blue is festivals, green is theater companies, etc. The larger the dot, the greater involvement of the organization in the network. To drill down into more detail, I promise you that's the most complicated image I'll show. To drill down into more detail, the next few images isolate different aspects of the data. So this one is a different version of a world map, with each organization grouped according to country of origin. So Julie's now got the arrow on Australia. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner. It's obviously the biggest dot because this is the Australian data. You can see New Zealand in the bottom right-hand corner of the image. And Jules, do you want to go to show where North America is? We've got North America on the far left-hand side. So this is it's a map according to longitude and latitude. It's just presented very differently. The thickness of the lines, just like in the network illustrations that Julie showed you, the thickness of the line is an indication of the traffic. So we've got far more intensive traffic between Australia and Europe. This is another way of demonstrating that data. I'll just read out a couple of those countries.
Want to go into the...
If you can. Okay, so we've got the UK, then Ireland, we've got Luxembourg, very large. There's a production company that's based in Luxembourg. Germany, Austria, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and down Greece at the bottom, the last one that you can see there. Okay. Okay, so the density of the lines between the countries demonstrates the depth of the trade in the window. And the positioning of the countries, as I said, is longitude and latitude. Okay, two more versions of maps demonstrate the relationship in slightly different ways. So this one depicts the same countries without geography. So we've taken geography out and let the computer decide where the dots go based on the strength of the relationship. So you've obviously got Australia in the middle, and the UK is very close. Now, for those of you who have excellent eyesight, you might also see that there's England and there's Scotland as well as the UK. We've not interfered with the data, shall we say. We've left it according to how the organizations define themselves. You can imagine National Theatre of Scotland is not necessarily going to want to be included as the UK. So we've left it as Scotland because that's how it's identifying itself. And again, you can see the strength of the relationship, the intensity in the thickness of the lines, the frequency of the lines. Okay. Now the next one, this one demonstrates, we've taken, in this one it's the same data, but this time we've taken Australia out of the equation to see who else is in dialogue with each other. So Jules, can you just go right down to the very bottom? In this one, we've got about 10 countries at the bottom who are not connected to anyone else. So what that's shown us is there was a production that these countries, organizations from these countries had with Australia that was just a one-off. It wasn't actually brought to Australia through Europe. It wasn't brought from somewhere else. And if you can't read it, those countries at the bottom are South Korea, East Timor, Cambodia, Malaysia, Slovenia, Belarus, Taiwan, Japan, and India. And what interests me is just how many of those are Australia's closest neighbors. Mm. Now, if we move up to the top of that image, where the much larger concentration is, all of these countries are talking to each other regarding the exact same productions. Mm. So Australia is very much peripheral, shall we say, in the development of that dialogue. The productions are coming to Australia. There's not a two-way relationship, as I'll move on and talk about. Okay, have a sip of water. Okay, so does this reflect Australia's trade interests? Here is the balance of trade in Australia based on 2013 data, right in the middle of our survey window. Exports to China increased markedly this year and have continued to increase since, while exports to the UK dropped, but otherwise they are more or less stable over 5 years. I checked 5 years either way. If you look at the rank of these nations and the amount of exports, imports, there is little correlation between these stats and the maps of performance intersecting with Australia. Mm. In the commercial market, while Australia's major trading partner is China, its arts trading market is the US, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but this traffic is not necessarily balanced. The performance data bears a little more relationship to Australia's cultural heritage, and this is the demographic breakdown based on 2011 census data. To look at the data in more detail, we can see where co-productions are. Yep, okay, we're going to get this map up. Yep. This is an illustration of co-production, so between Australia and one other nation. It suggests that UK and Germany are not only exporting their own work, but are responsible for a large percentage of the international, non-European work that is getting to Australia. Australia is working directly with UK, Germany, France, and Belgium, and in the Asian region, but it is an indirect purchaser of work from the rest of Europe, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, South America, and North Africa through the UK, Germany, and Belgium. And we know that organizations like the Barbican are central to the trade in productions, but we need to investigate further, and this has been harder than we expected. Some of these may appear to be anomalous, some of these connections, and we'll return to the prominence of Belgium later. It is tempting to assume that this is the way the international arts market is currently structured, but we've investigated several other festivals in our geographical region which don't appear to be following this model. Tokyo is focusing more on its Asian region and attempts to suggest cultural exchange, while Hong Kong has a good balance of Asian and European work. Despite the proximity of major festivals in Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Shanghai, none of these organizations is acting in any auspicing capacity towards Australia. There don't seem to be co-funded productions with them or with major production companies or venues in our region, beyond some connections between, for instance, the Shandong Cultural Center and the latest AusAsia Festival, and I can talk more about the AusAsia Festival. These maps and network graphics can show us what is getting through cultural border controls in Australia, but they can't show us the forces that are shaping these patterns. To really understand this cultural trade, we need to know more about the money trail. We've begun looking at where the sponsorship comes from for these festivals to see if it has influenced what is being programmed. And this is a list of the different types of sponsors or sponsoring agencies within our data window. I grouped them into these categories. Interestingly, the three mining and fuel companies at the bottom are all sponsors of the Perth International Arts Festival. There is further work to be done on what these companies tend to sponsor and to what level. The size of the sponsorship dot, if you remember back to that first image I showed, is connected with the number of mentions and the scale of contribution. But this depends on how many mentions a sponsor gets in programs that have been used for the data entry. It can't tell us how much money has actually passed hands. We also need to know more about the management of the festivals, the recruitment of festival directors and boards, before we can understand all the factors influencing programming. Leaving aside imports, our next question is what travels beyond our cultural borders, and are these exports going to Europe or elsewhere? Again, our work gathering and analyzing the data has only just begun, but there are 4 trends in and around the festival data. And the first is a continuation of a long history of self-orientalism. We wrote about the use of Indigenous culture as a form of national branding in women's intercultural performance, which accords with the international success of companies like Bangarra Dance Company. Within the country, we've noted a rise in Indigenous performance generally, although rather than being more numerous, the productions tend to be larger scale, part of festival circuits, main stage state theater company events, and often with significant investment. These productions are not, however, intercultural in the way we explored in women's intercultural performance, but it is an important move in a nation where the inequities between the first peoples and those who arrived later are stark, despite the 2008 apology to Indigenous peoples, and reinforcing the tragedy of this year's failure to meet the targets for the associated Closing the Gap strategy. The second point is the commercial world. On the commercial circuit, Australia is doing a successful trade in an aesthetic of excess or aggressive vulgarity. The most successful products have been The Boy from Oz and the recent mega tours of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. It has an Australian creative team, but like The Lion King, while it casts local performers, the strict adherence to its formula prevents intercultural interaction or regional variation resisting cultural drift. Interestingly, this production has toured mostly to the US, not as densely to Europe. Then number 3 is not a great deal of theatre made by our state companies, the major companies, is traveling to Europe beyond Kate Blanchett's Sydney origin productions of European plays by Ibsen, Botto Strauss, and Genet, and 2 recent productions by Simon Stone of Ibsen and Seneca. And the last one is that Australia finds more open doors with body performance. Australian Dance Theatre is an example of a successful troupe that has a strong history of overseas touring to Europe. Physical theatre, particularly when it is tied to outdoor events, has done well. This is sometimes attributed by critics to the influence of the Australian sports industry. Other Australian bodies are also exportable. Most recently, Back to Back, the Victorian Theatre Company, which includes physically and intellectually disabled actors. With these limited exceptions, the direction of travel for productions is overwhelmingly one way, Europe to Australia. I want to shift focus again from organization to consider artist networks. There are no theatrical families in Australia anymore, but individual artists or contributors manage to move across and between Australia and Europe with greater ease. Some, like Barry Kosky, stay in Germany and don't renew their Australian cultural roots. Others, like Robin Archer, Simon Stone, and Benedict Andrews, move between the 2 locations. Andrews is the focus of this section, and here is an indication of the type of travel he does from one place to another. And I'll explain it in just a moment, but I'll contextualize him for you. He's a sought-after export. Working since 1989, he has received acclaim across Australia and Europe, including extensive work at Berlin's Schaubühne. He has been a resident director at Sydney Theatre Company and has directed with Sydney's other main company, Belvoir Street. He has done high-profile shows at London's The Young Vic and a range of operas for European and Australian companies. So this image is calibrated by longitude and latitude again, and it shows his trajectory from his first days. Do you want to just go right down to the bottom again? So
Yep.
What you can see now on the screen is Adelaide, where he came from, and then at the top of the screen you can see when he first moved to Sydney. So it's quite accurate. It's not just the Australia longitude, it's Adelaide, Sydney. He's moving back and forth between Adelaide and Sydney. You can see other lines of other people who are moving with him. It's not just him. He's the blue line, though. And then he first goes to Europe. So the left-hand dot is Europe, but you see he's always coming back and forth. You can see, keep following the blue line. He goes to Europe, back to Australia, does more work, Europe, Australia, all the way along, and then starts working in Iceland, which, there's Iceland again, and in the top left-hand corner, The Maids goes to New York. So that's North America. Otherwise, it's a fascinating Europe-Australia dichotomy, trajectory the whole way. If you have very good vision, you can actually see the names of some of those productions, and we can explain more about individual productions if you wish. So as I said, the other lines that you can see here are other artists he continues to work with, which helps link the productions too. And increasingly he tends to work with 3 quite isolated artistic networks, Australia, Germany, and Iceland. And sometimes there are overlaps. This 2-way traffic means that he continues to function as a cultural transmitter in Europe between artists. So some Australian creatives are required to bring new approaches or a fresh vision. The bringing of European practice back to Australia means that some cultural exchange occurs in Australia. But the model echoes the traditional movement of raw materials in exchange for manufactured goods that has been the dominant trade relationship between Australia and Europe since colonization. Andrews functions as Australian raw material, but unless he is working with Kate Blanchett, his Australian productions haven't toured to Europe. We can see the influence of individual artists within this cultural force field in a slightly different form in the increase in Asian performance at the Edinburgh Festival because of the Australian artistic director, Jonathan Mills. He's no longer the artistic director, and he had previously worked in Australia at a time when strong performance relationships with Asia were de rigueur. Douglas Gautier, who spent many years living in Hong Kong, has shaped the AusAsia Festival in Adelaide accordingly. The influence of individual artists is also apparent in the connection between Belgium and the Border Projects, the Adelaide-based company that includes Cameron Goodall and David Heinrich, two performers who figure very frequently as contributors in our 2 to 3 year data sample. Goodall and Heinrich are founding members of this Adelaide company and established an intercultural collaboration with the Belgian company Enright Good. I don't speak Flemish. I don't know how much I've massacred that company's name. The creative link flows across various festivals, illustrating how individual artists can succeed in influencing intercultural relations. This small sample gives you a glimpse of how encounters by artists can subvert the dominant patterns of export and import. Ironically, in our book, our research on intercultural performance at the Adelaide Festival indicated that the festival was set up specifically to bring European culture and art to distant Adelaide. After a short time facilitating considerable cultural exchange, it appears to have reverted to its origins as the hegemony of European culture dominates. In symbolic capital, Australia still hasn't dented the 19th century model of centre and periphery. Trade relations can change, but the connection to European cultural heritage appears to remain. Last section, conclusion. Australia, as a predominantly European nation, is geographically located in an otherwise Asian context in what is chronologically and economically deemed the Asian century. Yet politics and current events suggest a fundamental fear of Asia, however broadly configured, and that is, we believe, playing itself out in what performance Australians see in national festivals. The effects of a politics of protectionism and xenophobia are clear in the arts in a way that might otherwise not have been apparent, and that are definitely not intercultural.
So our final statement, I suppose, is our distant visions highlight the presence of the heritage of the European canon in today's global arts market. Since 2000, every 10 days, a doll's house has opened somewhere in the world. In Australia, adaptations of European classical, Renaissance and late 19th century drama dominate our current repertoire, and the number of new Australian plays is dropping. And it's not just our theatre industry. The 2015 Vienna Festival programme for this year has 39 productions from 20 countries, amongst which are adaptations of Ibsen, Shakespeare, Sophocles, Marlowe, Chekhov, Gogol, Dostoevsky, the Old Testament and Homer. Women's Intercultural Performance was an optimistic book, fueled by the creative energies of women artists challenging the cultural boundaries of 1990s. Our rethinking of interculturalism using distant vision has produced a somewhat colder and more pessimistic picture of the forces at work. We're sorry.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot to you both. Fantastic joint paper. A great example of how those tools, I think, reveal so much in terms of content, but also in terms of methodology, so how we actually go about doing what we do. So massively stimulating. It's 12:20, so we've plenty of time for questions and discussion. Would anybody like to start? Yeah, Justin?
Thank you very much. I thought that was very interesting. And when you began, I was beginning to wonder, well, what's quantifiable about performance and theatre? And I think you did a really good job of taking metadata related to performance, so the actors, the directors, the place of production, and using that to figure out patterns. And I really liked how you then, albeit briefly, just drilled in to show specific examples of an actor moving between productions. So I was then struck by a point you made about this kind of doll's house, which you patched together from all the various productions, and these 70 plot points that you determined were in common. So it's really a methodological question. How did you manage to do that?
Okay.
Are you taking the texts of these particular
Well,
productions?
this is what I mean. That's why I said with network analysis. The first thing we did was just take a very standard way that you look at break down a text. We took the Ibsen's text, the Dano-Norwegian version, and we worked out where if you were in a Stanislavskian sense, you'd be saying where the breaks are. Okay, so we worked out that there are 70. We reckon 70 plot events. Once we'd done that, we created a network diagram of that, and I can show you later if you want, which is, so you actually work as a network. And then we took the best documented versions that we could find, and they could be really good textual versions if they were giving us enough information. But mostly what we tried to do was get electronic versions so that we could actually time and be able to analyse. So we then created network versions of all of these, right? So we took kind of, first of all, the ones that were the best quality data we had. Then we identified what had already been knocked out as common from that. And then we said, well, okay, we know we've got this particular plot event that seems to be common. Let's go looking until we find somebody who's not using it, and then it drops off. So gradually what we did, we most probably used about 70 productions to be able to get down to that, using the best possible documentation that we could, translations, adaptations, and so on, some from written. But that was really, and it was only, we actually only found 5 plot events that we could say were common out of, and then of course you have to say, well, okay, that plot, but the whole thing about the changes in character and whatever, so then you have to put all that other information. But what we did was use network analysis to come up with the graphics to be able to do the comparative work.
And the graphics for those look totally different than the graphics
Yeah.
you've seen. It's a completely different way of presenting, completely different way again of presenting that data. But I've seen them. It was really quite stark, the differences from production A to production B.
And this is one of
Quite convincing.
okay. What we did find was absolutely fascinating finding that it seems to be a common feature of adaptation that there is a new plot event placed at the beginning and end that bookends a production, and that we found across the board. We found even if it was just the way that the character was introduced, and it's a pre plot event before the play starts or the production or whatever starts. So that seemed to be really clear that people were already framing their work in that way. So there were things like that we found that were common, that were not from Ibsen's text, but we found about adaptation.
Actually, following up on methodology, which I think is really challenging here, it's a very strange echo I'm getting in my mind. But when you talk about breaking it down, into certain, to find the common elements or the patterns, this is something that folklorists have specialized in. So like you take any number of variations of a story, or like I'm working on the Ramayana at the moment. So we have, there are certain kinds of scholars who can tell you there are X number of distinct Ramayana versions, where there are distinct stories. But there are these, of course, there's what we call a Ramkatha, which is a story, that kind of is the common grid. So there's that kind of methodology that has nothing to do as such with network. But what your innovation is that you're taking that breaking down methodology and you're projecting it, and you're finding a language, a visual language, a spatial language to map it.
Yes.
Now that's exciting at one level, but there is, I don't know, there seems to be a disjunction somewhere there, and I can't, there's too much for me to process to even think about that. But maybe there's more than one methodology at work in what you're doing. This seems to me like the interesting aspect, and the more tension perhaps there is between these methodologies, I think the lapsed interculturalism that you are very candid about, you know, within this framework of global network theory might be reinscribed in some ways, because obviously you don't want to give up the tremendous kinds of insights that you have gained from your intercultural performance book. But obviously this is a different endeavor, and therefore we cannot expect the same things. That I think is very clear.
I think, can I just say that
Yeah.
I think that we don't want to get hung up on what we actually don't really want to find a core. In fact, what we're doing is trying to chart diversity. What we're interested in is the fact that this work, it's not really saying let's find something that's common. I mean, I would have been delighted if I could have said there was nothing common, you know, but actually I can't. You know, we did find some things that were common, and in a way we jumped into the language of the helper, you know, that is actually coming straight out of prop and notions of folklore. But it's not that we're trying to get to kind of some structuralism. It's actually what we're interested in is the idea of diversity and the force fields that are constraining it. That's really at the bottom of it, not trying to say we can come up with the production at all. It's actually wanting to look at diversity as basically a dialectic in which the diversity is functioning with the way that the signifying system is.
Is it, I'm curious to say, is it diversity or is it distribution?
No, diversity.
You know? Because if you deal with diversity, then I think I've had the same question, say, with what Chris Baum is doing with his Global Theatre Histories project, which is also very spatial. And yes, you learn a hell of a lot about transmissions, okay? So how this goes here to there. But I'm not sure what you learn about what is actually happening in that location. You know, how much can you really get of that? Now, no methodology can cover everything, so it's not a fault or accusation. I'm just trying to figure out how, there can be a supplementarity somewhere over here. Because for me, diversity will not work if you do not really investigate what is happening in specific locations.
Yeah, and so on a methodological level, what we do is we say, if this field is one of diversity, we look at pattern.
Okay.
Once the pattern's there, then you drill down. So you do get to the qualitative analysis. You're not just staying at that.
Yeah.
But what you're saying is, instead of trying to explain the diversity of it, you say that is common. This diversity is common. We don't have to actually explain it. When the pattern appears, what's causing the pattern? And then you drill down. So you get to the same point. You know, I would get to, or Joanne and I can get to, a particular production somewhere where you really exploit, but you found it not because you said, oh, I'm going to go and investigate X. You got there because the discipline is you must let the pattern dictate where you look, not your desire to find.
Can I answer that from a different perspective through the Australian material? So Ausstage has been around for over 10 years now. It's a very useful tool, having all of that data about what gets performed in Australia. It's good for students. They can investigate how many productions of Waiting for Godot there have been, or Dawn's Party, or whatever it happens to be. That's got its uses, but we're trying to find out what else we can find out from it, what else there is that we can learn about Australian performance over this time. So we are definitely bringing multiple methodologies to it, and then figuring out, well, now what do we do with it? And the answer, my answer, is going to be very different from Julie's or from yours, because then you still follow through according to a lot of the same methodologies that you might use otherwise if you weren't using Ausstage. It's not just gathering the data, it's then up to you what you're going to do, where you're going to go. And I think we had a line in the paper at one point that distant reading and close reading are not mutually exclusive. You know, you start the distant reading to find out what you are then going to read closely.
Can I ask a question that kind of drills down into some of that data actually? Because I was very struck at the end, I forget the name of the Australian director.
Benedict Andrews.
Yeah, I was thinking Benedict Anderson, and I wondered
Yeah.
if that was before the incident, given the topic of the conference. But what really struck me was the kind of the plays that he was producing. So you've got your Three Sisters, and your Sarah Kane, and your Macbeth. And as I saw you scrolling through that list, what really struck me is that it's very similar to the recent career path of other male directors who have gone global, first in the West End and then to New York. So people like Ivan Van Hove or Thomas Ostermark, for example, have quite similar CVs. So are we actually seeing in this case, not just that you mentioned the dominance of the European canon, we're also seeing that for a particular kind of director, there is a career path that has been pre-mapped out by predecessors. And a particular kind of performance of the masculine director there, the auteur director as well.
That's the kind of question that this
Yeah.
lets us now start to investigate. So I can't give you an answer,
Yeah.
but I think you're right,
Yeah.
and it would be
Okay.
very interesting then to investigate.
Yeah, but it's a great example of the kind of data or the kind of ways in which you can use that data. And I did want to make the point as well that Ausstage is linking up with Ibsen Stage, and that in addition Anna McMullen in Reading is developing a national performance database for the UK. So we can bring those three databases together. We need one for Ireland, obviously. We do have playography, but something that would work there too. So the ability to actually start to I guess, push out of those national contexts, push away from Norway, push away from Australia, into, it would be wrong to call them global contexts, but certainly more internationalised. Do you think that will produce different forms of pattern, or do you think that you'll see the same things being reproduced over and over again?
Oh, I think that we'll that what I, I'm born again digital person thing, because what I find fascinating about it is the questions it makes you ask, and so I'm sure that it will provoke us into many more questions than we have thought about in relation to how the canon, the European canon, is working interactively and in terms of theatre cultures.
Great, okay. I think we're going to have to leave it at that, just looking at the clock. Charlotte, we're due back at 2:30, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So all that really remains to say is just thanks to our two speakers for